have no further questions.
Let me get a sense from the other attorneys. Would we be going DEQ questioning and then constitutional questioning? And we're at a point where we would normally take a break, so I wanted to test the water to see how long you're going to take.
2 minutes, maybe.
2 minutes worth?
Long enough that I would like to take a restroom break before I go.
You want to take a break now?
That's fine.
Before we take a break and go off the record, I just wanted to note that Council Member Cora joined us during the course of the questioning of this witness, and other than that, we can now go off the record.
Sure to keep going.
So, can I sell you a ranch with a bunch of island of the elephant children?
I wouldn't.
All right, are we ready to resume? Ready? Okay, let's go back on the record. And I think we were about to have, I guess this is technically cross-examination by DEQ.
And it'll be rigorous.
You may proceed.
Mr. Brockman?
Yes,
You talked about not providing an estimated marketing time for this property because it wasn't a condition of your appraisal contract, right?
that's correct.
So you usually charge for that information, right?
Yes.
Will you give it to us for free? What do you think the estimated marketing time for these properties is?
If you listed that today at that value, I would say it would sell in 12 months or less.
Would it be hard to sell these properties,
I don't feel it would be.
even if they're really big?
It'd almost be easier.
Why is that?
They would be referred to as trophy properties. There's very few of them, and there's a lot of people out there with great big checkbooks. And they love to buy them and go back to the country club in Atlanta and your boy says, how big's your ranch? And the one says, mine's this big. And when they don't borrow money, they don't get appraisals, they write checks for them.
I wish I was one of those people. What do you think the cost to the seller would be if the owner of this property had to sell the ranch?
The brokerage fee would, and I'm talking about my brokerage firm, I can't speak for any others, around 4 to 5%.
4 to 5% of
Yes.
the value of the sale?
Yes,
Now, this is the most important question I'm gonna ask.
yes.
Serious. Do cows care if they live by a coal mine?
No, they do not.
I have no further questions.
All right, are we to contour now? Am I right?
Yes, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Go ahead, Council.
Hello, Mr. Brockman. Thank you for being here today.
You're welcome.
Before this proceeding, has anybody ever told you that your appraisals were bad?
Objection, bad maybe isn't a term that Mr. Brockman is familiar with.
Well, it's a yes or no question. I technically it's cross-examination. I'm going to allow you to answer the question if you
Can
can.
I elaborate?
Please.
If I'm involved in litigation, obviously I'm appraising for the plaintiff or the defendant, and the opposite party might catch me in the hallway of the courthouse and call me naughty names and tell me I don't know what I'm talking about.
But let's be clear, in this particular case, when you did your appraisal in 2017, did you know if this was in litigation at that time?
No, I did not.
Okay. Have you ever been grieved or had a complaint against you filed at the Board of Certified Real Estate Appraisers for the state of Wyoming?
No, I have not.
And in fact, I think you testified that you've been a member, you sat on that board for some time, correct?
6 years, 2 terms.
During that period of time, did you have to consider complaints lodged against other certified appraisers?
Yes, I did.
Okay. But again, have you ever had a complaint filed against you in the state of Wyoming?
No, I have not, nor in any other state.
You read my mind. I was going to ask you that question next. Let's jump to Exhibit CCW number 1, which is your appraisal report. And let's look at page 90009.
I'm with you.
Okay, you testified earlier that you did not use the income approach to value, correct?
That's correct.
And you also testified that you did not use the cost approach to value, correct?
That's correct.
Did you consider using those approaches?
Yes, I did.
And why did you choose not to use them?
In the cost approach, you estimate the depreciated replacement cost mean of buildings. For the most part, the buildings on the Bel Air Ranch are old. I didn't feel it would represent an accurate depiction of the value of the depreciated replacement cost. The land value gets done in the sales comparison, so I did not use that. The income approach was because of the wide variability of the overall capitalization rates. On a ranch, they'll run from 0.5% to maybe 2% at the very most. So when you capitalize an income stream with that much variability, it's too wide, it's not accurate.
Is it unusual to conduct an agricultural land appraisal without using the cost or income approach to value?
I do not believe it is unusual.
At your time on the board, did you ever have a case come before you involving a complaint that an ag appraisal failed to use the cost or income approach to value?
No, I did not.
In your opinion, is your appraisal compliant with USPAP?
Yes, it is.
And I'm not going to attempt to say what USPAP is. I think you've testified to it twice. If it were not compliant with USPAP, would you be exposing yourself to some sort of discipline?
Possibly.
You got a question from Ms. Anderson about when you were given the assignment to do this appraisal. Did anyone at Contura Coal ever tell you how much they wanted this value number to be?
No, they did not.
Did anyone at Black Jewel ever tell you what they wanted your value opinion to be?
No, they did not.
What about anyone in the Department of Environmental Quality? Did they tell you what number they expected to see?
No, they did not.
Mr. Brockman, what would you do if someone came to you and said, Mr. Brockman, I want an appraisal and I want it to be $29 million?
Thanks for calling and have a nice day.
Why would you say that?
I have to shave every morning. I like the way I look at it. I have a reputation, I have integrity, and don't do it.
And just to be very clear, did anybody on behalf of any of the parties in this proceeding tell you what number to arrive at?
No, they did not.
Okay, let's turn to page 11.
I'm there.
Talked about this earlier, that the appraisal use particular case, I think if you look at the top of page 11, you say appraisal use, correct?
Yes.
And what was as you understood the assignment, what was the appraisal use?
The value was the property was to be considered by the DEQ for their bonding, part of their bonding requirements.
Does the ultimate use of your appraisal change anything in your methodology?
No, it does not.
Does the ultimate use of the appraisal change the value calculation that you come up with?
No, it does not.
Does the ultimate use of the appraisal report affect your conclusions in any way?
No, it does not.
Let's say hypothetically, a bank came to you and asked you to appraise the Black Thunder Ranch for purposes of a loan, okay?
Okay?
Would your methodologies be any different in that circumstance than they were in this case?
No, it would not.
And would your ultimate conclusions about value have been any different?
No, it would not.
On page 11 of your appraisal report, or at least what's identified as Bates number 11, you have an area that's listed as market conditions. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Why would you include market conditions in your appraisal report?
To tell the reader, the user, what's going on out there. What's going on in the market? Who's buying? Who's selling? What's on the market?
And is that important to your ultimate conclusions about value?
It has an influence on it, yes.
Let's turn to page 12 of your appraisal report. If you look down at the third to last paragraph, it begins with researched public records. Do you see that?
Yes, I did.
Can you read that paragraph for us?
Researched real estate records in the Campbell County Clerk.
Wait, Mr. Brockman, I'm sorry. I want you to read the next paragraph.
Sorry. Research public records, clerk treasurer, assessor, zoning, farm service agency to obtain any information relevant to the property.
Why would you have done that as part of this assignment?
To gain more knowledge about the property I'm appraising.
Did you, as a part of your assignment, pull the county assessor records with respect to either of these parcels? The ranches were assessed at?
Oh, you know what? I didn't look at that.
Why not? And
It's irrelevant.
can you elaborate on why you believe it's irrelevant?
I think they're way off. I don't think, they do not represent market value.
Do you know what they do represent?
In agriculture, they've got some kind of a productivity formula, and I don't have a clue about that formula.
Okay, let's turn to page 13 of your appraisal report, please. The second paragraph, could you just summarize what that says?
After forming my opinion, do you want me to read the whole thing?
You can read it or you can summarize it, whatever you prefer.
I'll read it.
Go ahead.
After forming my opinion, I reviewed my analysis and compared my concluded value with the 11 current listings in the eastern part of Wyoming. Comparing my value to the asking prices of listings, I believe my value opinion is certainly within the values indicated by the market and is a reasonable and probable value of both properties.
So, Mr. Brockman, why didn't you just provide the listings and say, that's it, my opinion of value is based on the listings?
Listings are normally clear at the top, oftentimes not at market value.
Sale?
A paired sale. A listing is a property listed for sale. A paired sale, if I'm pairing sales, I'm looking for value for does the market give a value or take away value from pairing those properties?
Can you ever have such a thing as a paired listing?
I've never done that.
And is that because the listing is simply asking price and nothing more?
That's correct. It's not a sale.
Section that you've labeled comments. Can you read that out loud?
If offered, listed at or near market value, will sell within 12 months.
And that's consistent with the testimony you just gave to Mr. Castee, right?
Yes?
Okay, let's look at page 15 of your appraisal report. At the end of the first paragraph, you state, much of the land is held for future mining of coal. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
You remember Ms. Anderson asked you some questions about that.
Yes, I do.
And what I want to ask you is, Well, first, can you just give a brief summary or overview to the council about what the concept of highest and best use means in appraisals?
The use that'll create the greatest value for that property. And that use has to be legal. It has to be physically possible, financially feasible.
What was the highest and best use that you applied to your appraisal?
Agriculture.
Okay? And why did you not apply a highest and best use of potential coal mining?
But that's out of my pay grade. I'd have to do a lot of research to become an expert in that field, if at all.
In your experience, is there anything out of the ordinary for in this appraisal in applying the highest and best use as agricultural?
No,
Let's turn now to page 16 of your appraisal report. In your experience, does it matter how large a ranch is when determining its appraised value?
no, I test for it though. I pair sales to look at, what's the market telling me? Is there a break at 1,000 acres, a break at 4,000?
And in this particular case, did you test for that?
Yes, I did.
And what were your conclusions? Is there a break?
No, there was not. After a couple hundred acres, and then you're at a little hobby farm.
So do you have any doubts about the validity of your opinions based on the size of your paired sales?
No, I do not.
Let's look on the same subject quickly at page 32 of your appraisal report. Ms. Anderson asked you several questions about the location and size of your paired sales. You remember those questions?
Yes?
Is it unusual in an ag appraisal to use a paired sale that's 30 miles away from your subject?
No, it is not.
Is it any sort of an error, or does it affect your opinions at all?
No, it is not.
Is that something that you would typically rely on for rural agricultural appraisals in the state of Wyoming?
Yes, it is.
As you sit here today, do you remember if there were any other sales data anywhere closer to the subjects?
If there were any closer to the subject, I was not aware of them, and I looked.
And in fact, I think you said it wasn't just looking in your own information, you talked to other appraisers and brokers.
Yes.
Okay? You answered some questions about potential variances in value between northern Campbell County and southern Campbell County. Do you remember those questions? Isn't it true that in your report you addressed some of those findings?
Well, I kind of thought I did.
And in fact, let's take a quick look at it on page 32. If you look at the middle paragraph, I want you to read for the council the sentence that begins, "In reviewing all of my sale data." Do you see where I'm at?
No, but I'll get there. Are we in the middle of we're on page 32, correct?
Yes,
Are
sir.
we in the middle of the page?
Yes, sir. The paragraph begins, it's after number 5. Your next paragraph says, "I consider all of the sales." And halfway through that paragraph, you have a sentence that starts, "In reviewing all of my sale data."
Gotcha.
Will you go ahead and read that sentence out loud?
In reviewing all of my sale data, it seems the rangeland located north of Gillette, north of I-90, sells for more per acre than the counterparts in southern Campbell County. Want me to carry on?
No, I think that's sufficient. Mr. Brockman, did you take that variance into consideration in your analysis?
Yes, I did.
Okay, we heard a lot of talk about this wide range of values, particularly in the Bel Air appraisal. Do you remember that?
Yes,
Did you take into consideration the variances in price for northern and southern Campbell County when you decided which part of that range to select?
yes, I did.
Okay. Is there somewhere in the appraisal report that you could show the council where you took that into consideration?
I don't know.
I'm trying to think of a way to ask this. I'm not even gonna ask the question. Hey, we'll come back to that. Let's look at page 34 of the appraisal report. This is where you testified that here's a list of sales dating back to 2013, and they total 32,176 acres. You remember that?
But yes, I do.
Okay. Is this an exhaustive list for all the agricultural land sales in Wyoming since 2013?
No,
Do you have a database of land sales that you rely on in your professional
yes, I
practice?
do.
Generally, how large is your database of land sales?
It is Carbon, Laramie, Platte. There's the Albany, Converse, Niobrara County, Western, Crook, Campbell. Some of my data, Johnson County, some of my data goes back to the late 1970s.
I just want you to estimate, would you say you've got thousands of sales in your database? So how did you decide on the 5 sales to use specifically in this appraisal report?
On their recency, on their physical attributes, how similar is it to the property I'm appraising?
And is that something that you typically do in an appraisal?
Yes, it is.
And just to be clear, the list on page 34, that does not include the 5 sales that you relied on in reaching your conclusions.
That's correct.
But you did consider these sales, did?
Yes.
Okay. Let's turn to page 35. This is where the wide range language came from. I believe you were asked the question, why did you choose the high end of this wide range? And I believe you testified because of the positive attributes of the property, the subject property. Does that sound right?
That's correct. That's what I said.
Can you please explain to the council what you meant by the positive attributes of the subject property?
Has good access. There's a state highway on the east side of it, a county road on the south side. The land has been well cared for. It hasn't been overgrazed. Fencing looked average to above average. Water sources for livestock was adequate to more than adequate, and I just felt that it had a great deal of positive attributes. And when you compare that to those other properties, it rose to the top.
Do you feel that you have the expertise or experience to draw that conclusion that these positive attributes raise the value of your subject?
Yes, I do.
What's that based on?
My experience is not only as a real estate appraiser, but as a broker. And I might add that I run quite a few cows.
You had some questions about location adjustment. Did you make adjustments in your analysis to address the location of the subject properties?
No, I did not.
Why not?
I didn't feel it was necessary.
And do you think that that's appropriate in the context of an ag appraisal like this?
Yes.
And what is that opinion based on?
That I saw a real supportive dollar amount or percentage to adjust for the location.
Mr. Brockman, have you, I think you've already established this, but to be clear, you've been sitting in for this hearing for virtually the entire time, right?
Darn near.
Okay. Have you heard anything in this hearing that would change your value opinion as of 2017?
No, I'm not.
Have you heard anything in this hearing that would change your value opinion from your certification as of 2018?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Now, to be clear, you did have a conversation with another appraiser, Mr. John Sherman, regarding the work you did for the Bel Air and what's the other one called? Black Thunder Ranches,
Yes,
right?
Yes.
Okay. And can you just briefly describe the interactions that you had with Mr. Sherman regarding your appraisal report?
May I call him John, or you want me to call him Mr. Sherman?
Your attitude is just right that you better call him John.
John is a friend and a colleague, and he's a very good appraiser in my opinion. And he was retained, I believe, by Contour to review my appraisal. And rather than have a phone conference, John came to my office and he said, I have these concerns. And I addressed those concerns.
In the course of addressing those concerns, did your opinion of value change at all?
I think it changed a little bit, and I don't remember how much, but yes.
Was there anything out of the ordinary in that process in your experience?
No, I still have a little indigestion over the animal unit month that we agreed on, but it's minimal.
We better elaborate on that, just briefly for the benefit of the council. Just give us a real high-level overview of how the animal unit month number comes into consideration for your appraisal.
It's called a leasehold value. You have a value in BLM grazing or state of Wyoming grazing or Forest Service. Of course, if you discuss that with Forest Service, they would tell you there is no value, there's no guarantee. However, it's basically a difference in what the market, which you have to pay in the market on private land to graze, as opposed to paying, I think, BLM was $1.37 animal unit month this year. I pay $30 to $35 an animal unit month for that same cow running on somebody else's. So there's a benefit, a monetary benefit to that.
And as part of your analysis, isn't it true that you applied certain assumptions about the AUM value for the subject properties?
Yes, I assigned different values.
And is it okay to summarize Mr. Sherman's questions to you, that he was concerned that maybe you had assigned too high a value?
Yes, and that they weren't consistent.
At the conclusion of your meeting with Mr. Sherman, did you reach an agreement on what would be an appropriate allocation?
At the conclusion of the meeting, I think we did. And then we rehashed it again.
And again, I'll ask, is it unusual or out of the ordinary for that type of back and forth to occur between two appraisers?
No, I thought he did a very thorough job, and as somebody that works by himself, I welcomed it.
Let's look very briefly at Exhibit CCW number 2. And I'll just note for the record that this is also marked confidential and is subject to the same stipulated protective order provisions and minor deviations that we argued about so eloquently some time ago.
Are we, am I not in the appraisal report anymore?
No, sir, you're exhibit number CCW2.
Okay,
Do you recognize the first page of exhibit CCW2?
yes, I do.
What is it?
It's a letter from myself to John Sherman.
And what was the purpose of this letter?
Thank you for your thoroughness. I've made the corrections. And that was it.
Okay. You had a little bit of questioning earlier in your testimony about the recreational value and how you went about attributing recreational value to the Black Thunder Ranch. Do you remember that?
Yes, I do.
Is it fair to say that in your experience, having a recreational component on agricultural property tends to double the underlying ag value?
I don't know if you would say double. Some places it's more than A, some places it's 3 and 4 times.
Let's go ahead and look at the page that is marked CCW 109. You see at the top of that page, you have a column for grazing and a column for recreational transitional.
Yes,
Can you please explain to the council what those columns show?
the grazing on the left is sale prices per acre of grazing land. No recreational influence at all. Cows grazing, sheep. On the column to the right, those are sale prices per acre of what I would call Black Hills terrain. They either were in Weston County or Cook County.
So I want to clarify, are the 5 sale prices, or rather per acre prices listed under grazing, are those your 5 comparable sales from your appraisal report?
No, I don't remember.
It probably doesn't matter that much. Let's just quickly summarize. What is your conclusion about the impact of recreational type property on the Black Thunder Ranch?
What is the influence, that portion of the ranch, when directly compared, was given a different value than the grazing portion of the acreage.
Let's look at the middle paragraph of page 109,
Okay.
where you start, as you can see.
Yes,
Can you read the first sentence, please?
as you can see, the land values of recreational land compared to that of grazing land is generally more than double.
Okay. As you sit here today, do you recall how much of the Black Thunder Ranch you allocated as so-called recreational or transitional land?
10, 11,000 acres, something like that?
And that would be in your appraisal report
Yes, it
there,
would, yes.
okay? But is it fair to say you didn't apply a more than double recreation or grazing value to your Black Thunder?
That's correct.
Okay, why not? Why didn't you apply more than double?
Because the 5 values, are there 5, 6, 5? Those were pure Black Hills. The Black Thunder is right on the edge of it. It's pretty, it's scenic, but it's not in the heart of the Black Hills terrain. So I didn't feel it was done.
Thank you for that explanation. I think it's helpful. How long did it take you to do your appraisal report in 2017?
I don't have any idea.
More than a day?
Oh, yes.
I suppose, to be fair to you, you already told us that you spent 2 days just looking at the property, right?
That's correct.
And you can't estimate how many hours you spent on the project?
No, I never keep track of that.
Okay.
You do it.
My colleague just said that.
Unless I'm doing it by the hours, then I.
That's fair. And that's what I was going to point out, my colleague just mentioned. That must be nice. Mr. Brockman, let me wrap up my questions for you this way. You ended visiting with Ms. Anderson about how your appraised value, if you were off by $1, it could affect the state, right?
Correct?
And I'm not sure it was clear in the question, but implicit was if the value that you concluded was $1 too high, the state is going to lose out on some money here. Fair?
If I was $1 too high,
Mm-hmm.
yes.
Okay. What's the likelihood of hypothetically, if these properties sold, what's the likelihood, in your expert opinion, that they would sell for less than your appraised value?
Counselor, that's not fair because I just recently completed an appraisal on both these properties.
And before I even ask this question, I have to make it clear on the record. Have you and I coordinated in any way for your testimony today?
No, we have not.
Okay. Because you're reading my mind, Mr. Brockman. You have testified several times that you recently completed a new appraisal on the Black Thunder and Bel Air ranches, correct?
That is correct.
Is that appraisal actually done?
Yes, I mailed it to Mr. C.J. Fisk with Black Jewel.
Okay. And compared to your appraisal in 2017 and your certification in 2018, how does the valuation change, if at all, for 2019?
It's either $5 or $6 million greater.
And is that for both parcels combined?
Yes.
Did you go through the same basic steps and procedures and methods to reach your conclusions in your 2019 appraisal?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Are all of the opinions that you've expressed, including the opinion regarding your 2019 appraisal, to a reasonable degree of certainty based on your professional experience?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. Brockman. I really appreciate your time and testimony.
You're welcome.
I have no further questions for this witness, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Because he can't get sureties.
All right, thank you, counsel. Hold on just a second. Are we done with questions from the attorneys at this point?
Redirect.
By Black Jewel?
Yeah. Or if the council first.
I was gonna ask the council members as soon as we're done with it sounds like Council for Black Jewel has some redirect.
I don't, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Oh, okay.
Thank you for checking. I appreciate it.
All right, any questions from the council members for the witness?
Mr. Hearing Officer, or do you want to go ahead? Go ahead. Okay. This is Dave Bagley. So Mr. Brockman, I'm at packet exhibit 1 of the big packet there. Yeah,
Okay.
CCW 0035.
I'm with you.
All right, and so down at the very bottom, there's a block called Sales Comparison Approach Summary. And the first line under that is Property Basis Value Range. See that?
Yes, sir.
So, and I see a range of numbers, and which I won't mention, but how did you come up with those numbers that made up that range?
I will go into the narrative right above there. And towards the end of that paragraph, the sentence begins, "for these reasons."
Okay,
And then I believe the value of the ranch is greater than the 400 per acre and yet less than the 550 per acre. I'm hoping those numbers correlate from the low end to the high end.
okay,
For those two numbers.
okay, so that, you picked that as, your bracketing on a per acre basis, you
Yes, sir.
multiplied it by the size of the
The
ranch,
yes,
and that's how you came up with that number.
Yes, the deeded acres.
Right, okay, thank you. And so in a way, I'm an engineer and we're used to thinking in terms of uncertainty because there's always uncertainty. This, in a way, kind of provides an uncertainty range based on your professional experience. I think it's higher than this lower number, but I think it's lower, but somewhere in there is where the number most likely is.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You're the first engineer that ever admitted that it might not be totally perfect.
Yeah, Mr. Corbe helps a bit.
Any questions from other council members? Are we still on the phone with Mr. True? Yes. So, you guys hear me? Yeah. No questions?
Okay, Mr. Brockman, I do have one question. Given the size of these two properties, if these two properties came onto the market, would they so significantly increase the supply of land for sale that it would serve to dilute price in any way? I mean, you put this much land on the market, would that serve in any way to lower the overall price of the listings and how much you'd actually get in the market?
No, I do not believe so at all.
Okay. That was my only question.
All right, any other questions from council members? Are we finished with this witness then?
Yes, Mr. Hearing Officer.
Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Any further witnesses for Black Jewel?
Mr. Hearing Officer, and with gratitude toward the council, thank you for my indulgence. Black Jewel rests.
Right. Let's check in with the attorneys. Where are we? Have I skipped anybody? Contura?
Mr. Hearing Officer, Contura is prepared to present their case, and I haven't looked at the clock. We're happy to begin now with our witness, Mr. Sherman, but we can also be persuaded to take a short lunch break, whatever you would prefer we do, but we are prepared to proceed.
The council members have a preference? Keep going, so if you'd like to call your witness.
Absolutely, thank you. Contura Coal West calls Mr. John Sherman.
Can you raise your hand to be sworn? Do you swear or affirm the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, subject to the penalty of perjury?
Yes, I do.
Make question to the witness.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. Mr. Sherman, can you please briefly introduce yourself to the members of the council?
Yes, I can. My name's John Sherman. I'm a real estate appraiser out of Cheyenne.
How long have you been a real estate appraiser?
You're counting that up, it's just a little less than 40 years.
Can you give just a short summary of your education and background?
Yes, I can. I graduated from the University of Wyoming with a degree in general business with an emphasis in real estate, which is, back when I graduated from here, that's as close as I came to a real estate degree. After that, I took several classes related to appraisal outside of the college that are offered by professional organizations.
Mr. Sherman, are you nervous today?
That's a kind of good question. I'm really not any more nervous than anybody else in this room, other than I'm sitting at this desk instead of in the back where it was. But I have a condition called a familiar tremor, and this is how I can get into my voice, but mostly it's in my hands.
Have you ever testified as an expert witness regarding appraisals before?
Yes, I have.
And just generally speaking, how many times?
Once.
Okay, and It surprised me, it might surprise the members of the council, that in 40 years of practice, you've only testified once. Can you explain why?
On several occasions, I've been pretty close. I've done a deposition or two, but everything's settled.
Okay. So have you ever been recognized as an expert in real estate appraisals or appraisal reviews?
I've been recognized as an expert at a county assessor hearing, and they're arguing over the value that's being assessed on the property.
Is that the only time?
Yes,
Okay. Are you licensed as a certified real estate appraiser in the state of Wyoming?
yes, I am.
And we heard a little bit of testimony from Mr. Brockman about what that means, and we don't need to beat a dead horse, so to speak, but as part of that process, do you have an appraiser, certified appraiser number?
Yes, I do. I'm a little disappointed. It was number 27.
Why are you disappointed in that?
Well, at the time the legislation was pushed through, I was part of the crew that was working on that legislation. There were 4 of us. I really hoped to be at least 4 at the most, but there was a stumble and I ended up being 27.
Okay. Do you have any professional memberships or credentials that would be pertinent to the opinions you want to render in this case?
Yes, I hold the NAI designation. It's with the Appraisal Institute. I believe Mr. Brockman mentioned it. And it's an organization that's been around for about 30 years. It takes roughly 5 years of experience, several classes. You have to pass a comprehensive exam. You have to go through an experience review where they sit in a room and orally question what you've done.
How long have you been credentialed as MAI?
1992.
Have you served on any boards or other positions of leadership in the appraisal profession?
Yes, I have. I've served on the Certified Real Estate Appraisal Board. I was appointed by the governor to that board. In 2012, I served my 2 terms, 6 years. 3 years of that, I was the chairman of that board.
Are there any experiences in that role that might help demonstrate your expertise to the council?
Yeah, I would think so. I spent some time examining other appraisals that have been turned in, like challenges or problems that people had thought they were in. They would turn into the board, and we would review those to see if there was any action we should take.
Roughly how many appraisal reviews have you done in your career, whether with the board or otherwise?
I can't answer that question. I don't know how many. It's been a few. So I worked for the Department of Transportation for 30 years. And during that time, I started out as an appraiser, but as I worked through the process, I became a review appraiser for 5 or 6, maybe 7 years. And then after that, I was promoted to assistant administrator and then the administrator of the right-of-way section.
Did you continue to do appraisal reviews in those other positions?
Not formally. In the other positions, it was more just looking at it. And as far as the department's concerned, I did do work outside the department during that entire time, more as a commercial appraiser, writing appraisals for lenders, those kinds of things.
But just to be clear, are you still employed by the state at the Department of Transportation?
No, sir, I've been retired from them since 2012.
Okay. It's fair to say, though, that you've done more than probably 10 appraisal reviews.
Yes, that's accurate.
Okay. Mr. Hearing Officer, we would respectfully tender Mr. Sherman as an expert in real estate appraisals and appraisal reviews for purposes of his testimony today.
Any objection from any of the attorneys?
No objection.
All right. Motion's granted.
Thank you, Mr. Hearing Officer. Mr. Sherman, I feel silly calling you Mr. Sherman after what Mr. Brockman said, but I'm going to continue to do so, and I'm sorry. Can you briefly describe what you were asked to do in this case?
Yes, I was asked to review Mr. Brockman's appraisal and determine whether or not his opinion value was supported.
I want to pull up just a demonstrative exhibit, and maybe we should ask the indulgence of Mr. Hearing Officer, but what I'd like to do is just pull up, as demonstrative only, a copy of Mr. Sherman's report so that he can take a look at it and facilitate a little speedier use of his time today.
Is there any objection to that by anybody?
There's
Are
no
we
objection.
referring to a document that's marked as a number, with a number?
No, sir, this is simply a demonstrative exhibit. It's just his report.
Not being offered into evidence, but he'll look at it and testify from it.
Yes, sir. All right, let's.
Mr. Hearing Officer, I guess, sorry, the only question I would have is whether it's being offered for, as you just mentioned, for evidence to actually, is the witness going to talk about his findings and is
So-
that evidence, I guess, in this proceeding?
He's going to give testimony, and he's going to refer to this document while he's giving testimony, is that right?
Correct. We see this as sort of a roadmap for his testimony. We're not offering it into evidence. We're not giving a copy to anyone. We'll simply show it on the screen.
No objection.
All right. I think everyone understands that. Thank you. Go ahead.
We'll go ahead and pull that demonstrative exhibit up then. And we're going to do our best to blow things up. Can you tell from that far away? That's funny. Mr. Sherman, can you tell what that is?
Driver's license exam now?
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Do you recognize this, Mr. Sherman?
Yes, I do.
Okay, good. Let's just look at page 3. Now, to be clear, who gave you your assignment to do the appraisal review in this case?
Helen and Hart.
And that's me, that's us,
Yes.
right? Okay. This is page 3 of your report, and let's just zoom in on that portion that talks about, oh wait, what page are you on?
Oh, you want this page?
You know, you were right, page 3. This is what happens when we don't rehearse together. Sorry, Carrie.
That's okay.
I'm interested in purpose of the review. So can you, just looking at that, to refresh your recollection, explain to the council why you were asked to do this review?
I was asked to do this review to determine whether or not the appraisal that Mr. Brockman completed, if in that appraisal, he adequately supported his opinion.
Let's look, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, Mr. Sherman. Anything else?
Yeah, it was based not just on the actual appraisal, but also on the interview supplements that were turned in addition to that he presented to me during the interview process.
Okay, let's look very quickly at intended use. Why did you include this intended use paragraph in your report?
It's required by NewsMap that you identify the intended use of the document.
And you say here that the review is intended to provide an independent opinion of the adequacy of the information and analysis under review. Can you explain to the council how, or I guess, do you still believe that you're providing an independent opinion?
Yes, I do.
Did anyone at Holland and Hart tell you what opinion we wanted you to provide before you were retained?
No.
And I guess like I asked Mr. Brockman, what would you have told me if I had mandated the opinion I wanted to hear from you?
After 40 years, you occasionally hear those kind of requests, and I would not accept the assignment. I probably would have been a little more polite than Mr. Brockman.
Do you have any interest in the outcome of these proceedings?
None whatsoever.
I mean, I guess to be fair, you might have a passing interest in knowing what the result is, right? But is it going to affect your compensation in any way if you win or lose?
No. And I don't consider that I'm winning or losing.
So we've talked a little bit about what your assignment was. Did you complete the assignment?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And let's just look very quickly at page 2 of your demonstrative exhibit here. Did you reach an opinion about the adequacy of the support and the analysis in Mr. Brockman's appraisal report and the other documents you mentioned?
Yes, I did.
Okay, and what was the opinion that you reached?
Can't read it from here, but.
Well, and I don't necessarily want
Okay.
to tether you to this, but we can go ahead and blow it up if you think that would help. I mean,
No, I can, my opinion was that Mr. Brockman did support his opinion about him through his analysis, through the supplemental data, through the original report, through the, he did support his opinion about him.
and is that opinion, again, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty?
Yes.
Okay, let's talk about the process you went through to reach those conclusions then, or to formulate that opinion. Can you just give the council a high-level summary of what process you took?
Yes, first what I like to do is just kind of skim the report, read it rather rapidly, and just go through it. And then I go back after a few minutes or a day and just sit down with it and read every word and kind of crawl through it with a marking pen and a stack of stickies and figure out what I'm comfortable with, what I think I have some questions about. And then I make notes about what those questions are. After I do that, I contact the appraiser involved, and we have a phone conversation. Usually that goes pretty well. At this point, we set up an appointment because it's easier to talk about these things face to face. And Mr. Brockman made it clear that he had some additional data that he would like to share with me. So I went to Wheatland. I think we met for a couple hours and went through the report line by line pretty much. And basically what we did is go to the items that I had questions on. And we discussed those questions. And he explained his side, I explained mine. We kind of went back and forth on some things. Some things were just flat errors that we both agreed just needed to be repaired. So he offered to do a supplement to the report. During that same meeting, he showed me some additional data we have that supported some of his opinions. And then I left. I drove up towards Gillette, drove around where the subjects were. I did not inspect them. I just kind of drove through the area. I did not inspect the comparable sales, and then I drove back to Cheyenne. And I believe it was a day or two later, Mr. Brockman sent me a supplement for the big one, the Black Thunder. And then the next day I got a supplement that applied to the Bel-Air.
Thank you, Mr. Sherman. Why bother driving up to see the property?
I just wanted to get a feel for the area. When I worked at the DOT, I worked all over the state, but I haven't been up there in a while, and I just wanted to kind of get a feel for where it was. I wasn't trying to see every blade of grass, but I just wanted to get a feel for it.
Do you think it changed your opinion at all, not seeing every blade of grass on these two ranches?
No, sir, I don't.
Okay. You've alluded to having some questions about Mr. Sherman's appraisal report, and so let's look now at the list of those questions, and we're going to try to go through these pretty quickly.
Okay.
So we're going to look on page 7 of the demonstrative exhibit.
And you mean Mr. Brockman's,
What did I say?
Mr. Sherman's.
You see how I do that?
Uh-huh.
Thank you for catching me and for paying
I just
attention.
want to make sure I didn't do an appraisal.
That's true. I think you would know if you'd done a full-blown appraisal. All right. So Mr. Sherman, you recognize that this page is a listing of the questions you had for Mr. Brockman?
Yes.
Okay, so let's just zoom in at question number 1. Can you read that, Mr. Sherman?
Almost. Would you like me to read it out loud?
I want maybe this isn't going to work, not going to work because we're so far away. What's the basic overview of the first question or concern you had for Mr. Brockman?
Let's start with the recreational land influence on the Black Thunder Ranch. Mr. Brockman specified in his report that he felt there was an additional value associated with the recreational portion, the pretty scenic portion of that ranch. And he alluded to sales that would support that opinion, but I didn't find a specific sales in there or find a specific adjustment where you pair them together and actually prove that there is that influence. So I asked him about that.
So to be clear, did you have any opinion about the numbers he concluded?
No, sir, at this point in time, I just was asking for support for the numbers he presented to see where they had come from.
Okay, and so when you met with or talked with Mr. Brockman, did he provide that support to your satisfaction?
He said he had it and it showed up in the supplement. He did provide paired sales analysis that showed a difference.
And was that enough to satisfy your concerns regarding the recreational land adjustment?
Yes.
Okay. Generally speaking, how much of an impact, if any, did your concerns have on the ultimate value that Mr. Brockman concluded? Do you know?
I don't know if when he did the actual pairing, I think it did impact, because that value did change in the end. And I don't know if that pairing is what changed a little bit, or if it was the AUM discussion that we mentioned earlier, but it did change slightly in that process.
Okay. What was the second question or concern you had for Mr. Brockman?
Mr. Hearing Officer, I can tell the witness is having a hard time reading that. I got a copy right here. Can I just hand it?
That'd be great. Thank you, Mr. Cassidy.
The objection to that, just for the record?
No, I mean, it's been disclosed to the parties through discovery, so we all do have a copy.
All right.
And I'm sorry, Mr. Sherman, I didn't mean to hurt your eyeballs there.
Yeah, they're right. They're just getting a little old.
So again, just generally speaking, what was your second question or concern regarding Mr. Brockman's appraisal report?
Mr. Brockman specifically mentioned that he didn't feel that there was a difference in dry grazing land values and dry cropland. And in my experience in the Laramie County area and some places, I had seen some difference in those types of land where dry crop might be worth a little more than dry grazing. And he mentioned again that he had sales that proved that. I didn't see them in the report, so I asked to see those.
And did you get to see them?
I did see those in his office on the day of the interview.
And did that satisfy your concerns or questions about the possible difference between dry crop and dry grazing?
Yes, it did.
And I guess just to make sure everybody's on the same page, what is dry crop and dry grazing?
Well, grazing is just land that hasn't been improved, that you're just turning your livestock loose on. It graze it. Dry crop, you're raising wheat or something else on it. You can improve the ground.
Do you know if Mr. Brockman's appraised value changed at all based on your concerns in the conversation about dry crop and dry grazing?
And as far as I can tell, did not.
Let's look then at question number 3. This is one I've described as size adjustments. Can you just again summarize your question or concern in point number 3?
Yes, I had a concern about the large size of the subjects and the difference in size between the subjects and the comparable sales. In my experience, you can find a difference there. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, but it depends on the market and what's going on. I was concerned about that and wanted to see more evidence supporting the fact that Mr. Brockman felt there was not an influence in the size range he was dealing with.
And so did Mr. Brockman provide any information or data to help you with that question or concern?
Yes, sir, he provided me paired sales that showed, they're not perfect, they showed variances, but they were both ways, where in some cases the bigger branch was selling for more per acre than the smaller. But they weren't big differences. There was enough information to convince me that he had support for everything.
And so I think you just said it, but were you satisfied with the information that Mr. Brockman provided in his supplement?
Yes, I was.
And again, just generally speaking, do you know whether this question or concern affected the overall value that Mr. Brockman appraised?
It did not.
Let's look at the next one, number 4. And this is one I refer to as grazing lease allocation. Can you give us another kind of high-level overview of what your concern was in number 4?
Yes. This one we didn't totally agree on. We had to work through this one a little bit. Mr. Brockman had assigned a value to each. It's how you estimate the value of these ranches. You apply a per AUM value to the lease. So if you have 100 animal units and the value is $100 per animal unit, you'll do that math and add it to the value of that ranch. And our discussion revolved around what that number should be for those AUMs.
Did you and Mr. Brockman, I mean, we heard his testimony and it sounds kind of funny, but did you, first of all, you didn't have any sort of fist fight, did you?
I'm smarter than that.
Just sometimes how things get settled. Did you ultimately reach a consensus on what figures Mr. Brockman should use in the appraisal report?
Yes, we reached a point where I felt like he was supported his numbers and they were reasonable given the property involved.
Okay, and were those numbers higher or lower than the initial numbers Mr. Brockman had used?
Those were lower numbers than he originally used.
And do you know, as you sit here today, how, if at all, those changes affected the overall estimate of, it is not an estimate. I'm sorry, Mr. Brockman. Let's start that question over again. Do you, as you sit here today, know how those changes may have affected the overall appraised value in Mr. Brockman's report?
I believe they lowered the impacted Black Jewel maybe a little bit, or Black Thunder. I didn't do the math, and I know Black Thunder went down, but I'm not sure whether that was as much the discussion about the AUMs or if it was from the discussion about what the recreational ones were, but it didn't impact the other one at all.
Let's look at the last 2 points that you raised with Mr. Brockman, and I will tell you that I've read this over and over again, and I still do not understand what we're saying here. So can you summarize for us these last 2 questions or concerns that you had?
Number 5, I'll start with it. It's, I don't know if the report's laying here in front of me. You could go to a page.
If you're asking about Mr. Brockman's supplemental report, it is in front of you, and it's CCW number 2, and it's broken into, what? Oh, do you mean the original appraisal, Mr.
I
Sherman?
think the original would be the best place to start, where I could explain this a little better.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I'm sorry, I assumed I knew what you meant.
Sorry for the delay here. I'm trying to remember where that was at. Here we go. Let's see. This is the original appraisal, correct? Or is this?
If it's CCW1, the exhibit number 1, it is the original appraisal report. And Mr. Sherman, we might be able to go about this another way if you'd rather.
Yeah, I think, because I'm not finding the correct page for this. Okay. Here it is.
Okay, so first thing, it would help all of us if you could tell us the page number in the bottom right or left of that page.
CCW 0051.
Okay, Mr. Sherman, what are we looking at on page 51?
Okay, if you come down that first grid, it says land adjustment amount.
Yes,
Below that, you'll come to a row that's labeled grazing.
okay,
If you come across that row, it has the acreage size, and then it has a value of 392.
okay,
That's carried over to this is the comp. He carries it over to the subject. It should still be 392 and it's 400.
okay. And so did you point that out in your meeting with Mr. Brockman?
Yes.
And what was the determination that the two of you made?
He was going to correct that in the supplement. He did. And I can show you the other one on page 48.
And that's 0048,
Yes, it is.
okay?
You look at that same line under grazing. It comes across 350 is what the allocated price was on the comparable, and it comes over to 450 on the subject. That's basically a typo of $100.
Okay, and so did Mr. Brockman agree to change those to be consistent in carrying the number over?
Yes, he did.
Okay, thank you. That was actually really helpful for me. Number 6, I think, is your last concern that you expressed or question you had perhaps for Mr. Brockman. Can you just summarize that question or concern?
Yes, you can still use the same page that 0051 has this issue. It's actually caused by a rounding error in the software that develops this analysis. If you look at the bottom of the page, close to the bottom, in that second lower table, it says sale effective unit size, 7845 acres, and improvement value. It's got a contributory improvement value of negative 1465. You follow me?
Yes, sir.
Well, it's hard to have a negative improvement value. So that bothered me. It's actually pretty small. Potatoes, what we're talking about here, when we're talking kind of values we're discussing. But that is another glitch in the software program where when you're rounding these things, it fills in a difference. If you don't go to the nth degree on your per acre price, then it brings down a number that's either larger or smaller than the actual sale price when it multiplies it times the size of the ranch. And that's what happened. It just comes out differently.
You said small potatoes. Do you have an idea of how much this affected the ultimate appraised value?
0. It's just a pet peeve. I can't negative improvement value bother me.
Were you pretty thorough in your review of Mr. Brockman's appraisal report?
I tried to be.
And, well, we'll leave it at that. Just a couple general questions. for you then. I think somewhere in your report, you indicated that you did not do a full USPAP compliance analysis. Do you remember including that in your report?
Yes,
Does that mean that you didn't follow the applicable USPAP rules from 2017 and go through the report with a fine-tooth comb to make sure that he was compliant?
yes, that's what that means. I did not do that.
In your experience, having reviewed a bunch of appraisals over the years, I mean, do you have an opinion today about, well, let me put it this way. Do you have any concerns, or did anything in Mr. Brockman's report give you pause other than what we've talked about today?
No.
Totally changing the subject, just very briefly. You were here for the testimony in yesterday's portion of this hearing, correct?
That's correct.
And do you recall the testimony, I think it was Mr. Wentland, but I don't frankly remember at this point, about getting an abstract or a title abstract with regard to DEQ's interest in either of these ranches? Do you remember that?
Yes, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe there was testimony that they relied on attorneys, or the Attorney General's office.
Well, I mean, I believe that's right. The record is what the record is. But my question for you is, in your experience, is there a preference when it comes to either getting a title abstract or getting an attorney's opinion?
No, sir. I mean, I would prefer an attorney in my own personal opinion and my professional opinion. I'm currently working on a project right now where there's a title issue. We began with an abstract, but there's issues with the title, so we turn it over to an attorney at the recommendation of the title company. And that's happened to me before. For title opinions, generally you go to the legal counsel for that.
And when you say it's happened to you before, did you have any of those experiences in your time at the Department of Transportation?
Yes, it did.
And just generally speaking, what is your preference when it comes to either an abstract or an attorney's title opinion?
An attorney, trained attorney. Yeah.
Okay. Let's just wrap up then one more time. Based on everything that you reviewed, based on your interview with Mr. Brockman, based on his supplements and the additional data he provided, and I will add to that, based on what you have heard throughout the course of this proceeding, what is your opinion of Mr. Brockman's appraisal report?
My opinion is that Mr. Brockman adequately supported the values he presented with the supplemental data, the original appraisal, and the interview.
Okay, Mr. Hearing Officer, I don't have any questions at this time. Any more questions from Mr. Sherman?
What's the sense of the council members? Shall we break for lunch? Can we get a sense of what the cross-examination will be like for this witness?
You'd be surprised, I don't have so many questions. But,
I'm getting head nods here, let's finish,
okay,
let's,
okay, we can try.
cross-examination from our.
Okay, thank you. I guess we are now technically afternoon, so good afternoon, Mr. Sherman.
Good afternoon.
Okay. So you talked a little bit about what you were asked to do with, by Contura, right? Did Contura hire you? You mentioned Holland and Hart, but who was your client in this
Holland and
review?
Hart was my client.
Holland and Hart was your client. Okay. And Holland and Hart asked you to do essentially, I'd call it a peer review of Mr. Brockman's work. Is that a good summary?
They asked me to provide an opinion of whether or not he supported his value.
Okay. Is that a normal part of your job? Do you do these often for other appraisers?
Yes, they're not, I don't do as often as I do regular appraisals, and it kind of depends. For a time, that's all I was doing for Rocky Mountain Bank.
Rocky Mountain Bank, okay. See, we talked a little bit earlier in testimony and questioning about the mineral estate portion of this property. Do you remember those kind of questions?
Yes, I do.
Okay, did you look at all of the mineral estate value of these properties?
No, I did not.
Do you know who owns the minerals on any of these properties?
No, I don't.
Okay. We talked a little bit about this recreational adjustment and some of your other questions you had in Mr. Brockman, right? And you, I think, testified earlier that it changed the value of the ultimate appraisal.
Yes, the value changed by, I think, about $300,000 or so.
Do you want to pull up CCW Exhibit 2 in your binder there? Yes, yeah, it's after the appraisal, it's the letter, yeah, back to you. Do you see after, hello, John, that second paragraph starting with, I made the corrections?
Counselor, are we on the first page of that exhibit?
Yes, we are,
So that's-
yes.
107?
Yes, CCW 0107. And Mr. Sherman, do you see that paragraph starting, I made the corrections?
Yes, I do.
Okay, do you see the second sentence in there? Starting with as you can see.
Yes, I do.
Could you read that, please?
As you can see, it did affect my value opinion from $17,949,000 to $17,319,000.
Okay, so that's roughly a little bit over 600,000, right?
Yes.
Okay, so that was the amount that we were talking about just now, that after your peer review, or how you phrased it, Mr. Brockman came back and said, yes, the value opinion was somewhat incorrect, and I've corrected it. Is that a good way to put it?
That's definitely the difference, and it was as a result of additional analysis that he did with me.
Okay. Are you aware of whether that number got incorporated into the bond calculation of Department of Environmental Quality? Was it ever given to DEQ?
I have no idea, no.
You have no idea? Okay. Mr. Sherman, let's go back to CCW 1. Okay, where I'm going. Do you remember kind of the range of values that Mr. Brockman used to determine his appraised value of the land?
I don't remember the exact numbers, I do remember that he presented a range he talked about,
The range.
that it was in that range.
And as an appraiser, and you looked at this property, and would you have picked a different number in that range?
I did not appraise this property. I did not drive out and look at comp sales and do all the things that are required to do, provide an opinion of value. So I cannot provide an opinion of value at this time.
Okay. Alrighty. And we've heard a little bit of testimony about a 2019 appraisal that's now been done. Did you review that appraisal? Have you seen that appraisal?
No, I'm not seeing it.
Okay. Anything else? I think that's all I have. Thank you.
We got line DEQ.
Mr. Sherman, I have no questions for you. Thank you.
No questions, Mr. Hearing Officer, thank you.
Any redirect examination, counsel?
No.
Any questions from the council members for this? I'm not hearing any, so thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
I think we'll be taking a break now. Is that right? But Dex, can you give us an idea, council? I'm sorry for interrupting, but I wanted to get a sense of where you're headed next. Are you done? How much more time do you?
Mr. Hearing Officer, I am pleased to report that Conturico West rests.
Right? Get all the way through the cases in chief then? So will there be any more evidence after this? Is anybody proposing to present any additional evidence?
I am not.
I'm not.
No, sir.
Sir. So we're ready for closing arguments, I guess. Why don't we take a break for lunch, come back and do closing arguments? Will that satisfy everyone?
Really, did you do?
Yeah, that sounds great too, Conturico West.
Oh, it's been suggested, I invite you, well, would you like to do written arguments instead of oral arguments? You prefer to do oral arguments, counsel?
I would prefer to do oral arguments. I think it would be best to hear these while these things are fresh in the council's mind. Certainly, we'd be more than happy to submit those findings and conclusions if that's the council's desire and supplement to our closing arguments. But I think there's some things that would be good for you to hear.
Does everybody agree with what Mr. Cassie just said?
Absolutely.
I would defer to the council, whatever they prefer.
I've been asked by council members whether you're willing to indicate a limit or agree to a limit on the amount of time each of you spends on closing arguments.
How about the 10 minutes that was for opening? The same, if that's okay.
Will that work?
I was going to propose an hour. Let the record reflect that's a joke. 10 minutes is more than sufficient for us.
With no minimum.
That's correct.
Well, that's how we'll proceed when we come back from lunch. How long do you want to take for lunch? 1:30, 1:45? Okay, so let's return at 1:30. We can go off the record.
Okay.